Lorelai couldn't explain why it had become so hard for her to breathe, lying in her perfectly made bed in her flawless home. The air felt heavy, as if the walls of her fashionably gray-blue bedroom were closing in around her. The phone screen illuminated her face with a cold light as she lazily scrolled through Instagram, feigning interest in other people's perfectly staged lives. Next to her, Declan snored softly, his profile barely visible in the soft light of the nightlight. Once she loved him for this calm predictability, for being her anchor in the chaos of her turbulent youth. But now this calm had become unbearable. It wasn't comfort, it was stagnation. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. Everything was still. She tore her gaze away from the screen and looked at her husband. His face, still confident and firm a couple of years ago, now looked saggy and tired. The stubble that once gave him a masculine look now just looked unkempt. The shirt, neatly folded on the chair by the bed, reminded her of another purchase from the Big and Tall store. Lorelai closed her eyes, but instead of darkness, another face appeared before her inner gaze. The face of Axel, her first, and if she were honest, her only true, love. She remembered his smile, which had more audacity than tenderness, and how he held her hand as if it were a challenge to the world. Declan had never looked at her like that, never held her like that. He was too right, too predictable, too reliable. Reliability is not passion, she thought bitterly. Her phone vibrated. A new like on a friend's post. A beach, cocktails, a perfectly tanned man with $1 million smile. Lorelai glanced at Declan. He turned on his side, his soft snoring becoming a bit louder. Her irritation surged. She turned off the phone screen and stared at the ceiling. When did this happen? When did she end up here, in a marriage that felt more like a deal than a love story? Deep inside her, a feeling she didn't want to acknowledge stirred. Disappointment. "I deserve better," she whispered, and the words seemed to dissolve in the thick, suffocating silence of their bedroom. At that moment, she didn't even suspect that the words spoken in the dark would soon become a prophecy. Lorelai sat at the kitchen island, clutching a mug of hot coffee with both hands. From the next room came the sounds of the morning news, where the anchor cheerfully reported on traffic jams and the upcoming cold snap. Declan, in his usual stretched-out sweater, sat on the couch, hunched over his laptop. He looked familiar, slightly hunched, with a tense expression, as if the world were held together by the thin thread of his efforts. She watched him, and her heart ached. Somewhere on the edge of her consciousness, a feeling of guilt flickered, but it quickly drowned in a thick irritation. She tried to remember the last time she saw something more in him than just presence. When was the last time he made her laugh until she cried? When was the last time she looked at him with warmth instead of annoyance? "Are you working late today?" His voice, low and tired, broke her thoughts. Lorelai started. She looked up at her husband and saw him glance away from the laptop for a moment, waiting for an answer. He held a cup of tea, but his fingers seemed tense, as if he was afraid to spill it. "Yes," she replied, too quickly to sound natural. "I also have yoga in the evening." He nodded and returned to the screen. Lorelai felt that he wanted to say something else, but didn't dare. This moment, like many before it, slipped away into silence, leaving them both on different islands in the same ocean. Later that day at a corporate meeting, Lorelai caught herself thinking about something other than numbers and reports. Colleagues were discussing something, exchanging jokes, but her mind was elsewhere. She imagined what her day would look like if everything were different, if Declan were different. What if? This question haunted her with frightening persistence. When the meeting ended, her boss, a stately man in a perfect suit with a toned figure, approached her. His smile was flawless, and his manner exuded a slight thrill. Lorelai felt her heart quicken slightly. This man was the opposite of Declan, confident, strong, charismatic. He spoke to her, something insignificant, just a couple of phrases, but it was enough for her to feel alive for a moment. As she returned home, images swirled in her head again. She imagined walking down the street with such a man, feeling the envious glances of passers-by. She fantasized about evenings filled with laughter and sparks of passion that had long disappeared from her life. Declan met her at the door with a shy smile. "Hi, I made dinner," he said, gesturing to the kitchen where plates of chicken and vegetables were already set. Her irritation flared instantly. He was trying so hard to be good, but that was what annoyed her the most. Why did his efforts seem so pathetic? Thanks," she replied dryly, walking past him. Declan hesitated, as if pondering whether to say something. Finally, he dared. "Lorelei, can we talk?" She stopped, sighing with annoyance. "About what?" Her voice was sharp, almost accusatory. "About us," he said softly. "I know things haven't been right lately. I feel it." His honesty shocked her. She felt something shift inside her, but it wasn't a thrill. It was irritation. He was too soft, too vulnerable. "Declan," she interrupted him. "You're imagining things. Everything is fine." He fell silent, but something in his eyes dimmed. She saw it but didn't want to do anything about it. That night, Lorelei lay in bed with her phone in her hands again. Declan slept beside her, his breathing steady but heavy. She scrolled through the feed, lingering on photos of happy couples. She knew she wouldn't be able to sleep because the same question kept echoing in her head. What if? This question seemed poisoned, and this poison slowly but surely spread through her life, destroying everything around her. Friday evening promised to be ordinary. Dinner at a friend's house, conversations about nothing, and polite smiles over wine. Lorelei, standing in front of the mirror in the bedroom, carefully applied her makeup. Her bright red dress hugged her figure, accentuating her curves. She pondered for a long time what to wear, as if this choice mattered. Perhaps it was because she wanted to be noticed. Not by Declan, of course, but by others. She wanted to feel that someone admired her. Declan, on the other hand, looked like he had been forced to go. He stood by the wardrobe, struggling with the buttons on his shirt. The fabric stretched over his stomach, and he, frowning, tried to button it so it wouldn't look too tight. "Seriously, Declan?" Lorelei turned sharply. "This shirt doesn't fit you. Couldn't you have chosen something that fits properly?" Her voice cut through the room like glass on metal. Declan stopped, froze for a moment, then sighed and silently reached for another shirt. Lorelei rolled her eyes, muttering to herself, "Unbelievable." When they entered their friend's house, the atmosphere was already warm and lively. The clinking of glasses, the muffled laughter, and the aromas of gourmet dishes filled the spacious room. Lorelei quickly blended in, her smile bright, her voice ringing. She deftly navigated among the guests, throwing compliments and jokes that made everyone laugh. She was in her element. Declan, on the other hand, looked lost. He stood by the table with snacks, holding a plate of cheese and crackers. He tried to join a conversation with two men, but they quickly lost interest in him, turning to a more lively conversation with Lorelei. As if to emphasize this contrast, Lorelei laughed loudly, leaning back, her hand lightly touching the shoulder of one of the men. He was toned, energetic, and confidently held a glass of wine in his hands. Declan noticed this touch, and something inside him painfully twitched. Later, when everyone gathered around the large dining table, a series of stories and jokes began. Lorelei, already inspired by a few glasses of wine, started telling stories about her life with Declan. "You know," she said, barely hiding a smirk, "living with him is like constantly finding a compromise between patience and resignation." The guests laughed, but Declan already felt a growing unease. "For example," she continued, smiling, "once I found him in the kitchen trying to make himself breakfast. I almost cried with laughter when I saw him mix up salt with sugar." "Oh, that's nothing," she interrupted herself. "When we have dinner somewhere with a buffet, I almost feel like I have to watch him to make sure he doesn't take all the food on his plate." Laughter filled the room, but for Declan, it was white noise. Each word hit him like a hammer. He felt his face flush, and without saying a word, he stood up from the table and headed for the exit to the terrace. Lorelei watched him from the corner of her eye, but didn't get up. She continued telling jokes, winning the room's attention. Her voice sounded confident, but deep down, she felt a strange emptiness, dull and heavy. She knew Declan had left because Her behavior had hurt him, but she couldn't stop. Her sharp remarks and sarcasm were her weapon, her way of coping with the irritation growing inside her. When the evening came to an end, Lorelei found Declan by the car. He stood with his shoulders slumped, his face thoughtful. "Do you always have to make a drama?" she asked, her voice irritated. "It was just a joke." Declan turned his head to her. His eyes, usually soft, were filled with weariness and pain. "For you, everything is a joke, Lorelei," he replied quietly. "But you know what? It's not funny." She rolled her eyes and got into the car, slamming the door. He got in beside her, started the engine, and they drove home in complete silence. That night became a turning point for them. Lorelei thought she had handled the situation, that her biting words were justified. But Declan, looking at his reflection in the bedroom window, felt a decision growing inside him. He could no longer be part of this game. She didn't notice how he began to change. Chapter 4. The Beginning of Change. Declan woke up earlier than usual, when the sun was just beginning to filter through the thick curtains of their bedroom. Lorelei was still sleeping, her face turned to the wall, and her phone on the bedside table flashing with nightly notifications. Declan looked at her for a few seconds, feeling the heaviness that had settled between them, like an invisible wall. But today he didn't feel the usual apathy. There was a new spark in his heart. It was tiny, but its warmth was palpable. He got up, trying not to make noise, and headed to the garage. In the corner, behind a pile of dusty boxes and tools, stood an old treadmill, covered in a layer of time and neglect. Once, several years ago, he had bought it with the best intentions, imagining himself getting in shape. Now it was a symbol of his failures, but not today. Declan wiped the dust off the panel, checked the wires, and turned it on. The motor hummed and he stepped onto the moving belt. At first his steps were uncertain, as if he were learning to walk again, but after a few minutes the rhythm became confident. Sweat streamed down his forehead, his heart pounded in his chest, but with each minute he felt the tension that had been building for months beginning to ease. He knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, he felt alive. After the run, he went to the kitchen. Lorelei was already there, looking at her phone screen and stirring her coffee. On the stove stood his favorite pan for eggs, but she clearly had no plans to cook anything for him. This was another sign of how far their lives had diverged. "Good morning," he said, pouring himself a glass of water. Lorelei nodded, not even looking up from her phone. "You're up early today," she tossed out, her voice distracted. "Yes, I decided to start running in the mornings," he replied, trying to keep his voice light. Lorelei looked up for a moment, assessing him, then returned to her screen. "We'll see how long that lasts." The words hit him, but he no longer allowed her to control his emotions. He just nodded and began preparing himself a simple breakfast, an omelet with vegetables and greens. This time he was cooking for himself, not for her. At work, he delved into his finances. Declan had always been good with numbers, but now he was digging into the details: bank accounts, credit cards, household expenses. He opened a separate account where he began transferring his salary. His lawyer, whom he found online, advised him to do this to protect himself in case of a divorce. His colleague, Mark, noticed how focused he was on his work and, approaching him, patted him on the shoulder. "You're all about the numbers today. New project?" Mark asked. "Not quite," Declan evasively replied. "Personal. I need to reevaluate some things." Mark looked at him intently but didn't ask any more questions. Declan was grateful for that. Every morning started with a run. After a week, he added strength training, starting with simple bodyweight exercises. His body ached, but this pain was different. It was productive, restorative. He began to notice that his shirts fit a little looser and his breath no longer caught so quickly. But the changes were not just physical. Declan began studying meditation and mindfulness practices. He found a meditation app and started setting aside 10 minutes a day for silence and concentration. This gave him a calmness he had long lost. Lorelei noticed the changes, but her reaction was a strange mix of indifference and irritation. One evening, returning from a spa, she found him at the table preparing grilled chicken and salad. "Seriously, Declan?" Her voice was filled with sarcasm. "Do you really think this will make any difference?" Declan didn't answer right away. He carefully sliced a cucumber and only then looked at her. "I'm doing this for myself, Lorelei," he said calmly. She snorted and went to the bedroom, not trying to continue the conversation. Declan also began paying attention to his surroundings. He signed up for courses at the local center. Stress management techniques. There he met new people who shared their stories. One of the group members, a man named Greg, told how he survived a divorce and found himself through changes in his life. These meetings became a new source of inspiration for Declan. He didn't talk about Lorelei, didn't complain about her behavior, but became more and more convinced that he didn't want to be in a situation where he wasn't respected. After a few weeks, the changes became noticeable. His face gained clarity, his posture improved, and his eyes regained a sparkle he had long lost. Lorelei seemed not to know how to react. She continued to behave as if nothing had changed, but her gaze became more tense when she saw Declan cooking for himself, exercising, or calmly leaving for his classes. For her, it was strange, almost irritating. She felt like she was losing control over someone she considered hers. But Declan no longer belonged to her. He belonged to himself. This inner confidence became the beginning of his new life. Friday evening came faster than expected. Declan returned home later than usual, lingering at work to finish a project. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. He knew that tonight would be decisive. The divorce papers lay in his bag, neatly folded, like a symbol of his final decision. Lorelei, as usual, sat on the couch with a glass of white wine. Her fingers confidently scrolled through the Instagram feed, where the perfectly happy faces of friends and acquaintances created an illusion of a carefree life. She didn't even look up when Declan entered. "You're late today," she noted without much interest. "Yes," he replied, setting his bag down next to the couch. "We need to talk." Her eyebrows twitched slightly, but she quickly returned to her screen. "About what?" she asked dryly, not showing much interest. "About us," he replied calmly. His words made her pause for a second. She finally put down her phone, her eyes meeting his. Her expression was a mix of irritation and boredom. "Do you want to talk about your feelings again?" "Seriously, Declan, I'm tired of these conversations." His calmness remained unchanged. He sat down on the neighboring chair looking straight at her. "This isn't about feelings, Lorelei. This is about reality. I want a divorce." The words fell like thunder from a clear sky. Lorelei froze, her face completely blank, as if she was trying to comprehend what she had heard. "What did you just say?" Her voice became sharp. "I want a divorce," he repeated more firmly this time. "I've thought about this for a long time. This decision is made." She laughed, but there was no joy in her laughter. "Is this some kind of new act of yours? Do you want me to beg you to stay?" "Seriously, Declan, you're not even capable of that." His eyes were calm, but there was steel in them that she had never noticed before. "No, Lorelei, this is not an act. I can no longer live like this." She squinted, her face becoming hard. "And how exactly, in your opinion, are you living? You have a home, a stable job, a wife who—" She stopped, as if choosing her words. "A wife who what? Humiliates you in front of friends? Constantly reminds you how you don't meet her standards?" He interrupted her. She raised her eyebrows, surprised by his tone. "You're exaggerating, Declan. You always dramatize everything." He shook his head. "This is not dramatization, Lorelei. These are facts. I tried. I worked on myself, on our marriage. But you didn't even notice it. You didn't support me. You looked at me like I was a failure instead of seeing the person who loves you." Her face flushed, her voice grew louder. "Maybe because you are a failure, Declan. You don't inspire. You're not ambitious. Everything you do is just trying to prove something to me, but it's already too late. I'm tired of being with a man who can't even live up to his age." He endured her angry monologue calmly, then stood up. His voice became icy. "You're right. I was trying to prove something, but I won't anymore. I proved it to myself. And you know what? I no longer want to be with a woman who doesn't respect me." He opened his bag and took out the neatly folded papers. Placing them on the table in front of Lorelei, he gestured to them. "These are the divorce papers. They're already signed on my end. I talked to a lawyer. All that's left is your signature." She looked at the papers as if they were a poisonous snake. Then her gaze returned to him, filled with a mix of shock and fury. You planned this behind my back? How could you do this to me? I had to. You left me no other choice, he replied, putting away his bag and preparing to leave. She stood up, slamming her glass on the table so that the wine spilled onto the papers. Do you seriously think you can just walk away? That I'll let you do this? His gaze was unwavering. This no longer depends on your permission, Lorelei. I'm leaving. You can try to stop me, but it won't change anything. I've already made my decision. That night, Declan packed his things. He didn't linger with goodbyes. Lorelei remained sitting on the couch looking at the papers he had left on the table. Her face was blank, but inside her, a storm raged. She couldn't believe that the person she considered weak was now the one who had taken complete control. Declan stepped out of the house, closing the door behind him. As he left, he felt a strange sense of relief. This was not the end. It was the beginning. His beginning. Declan stood on the terrace of a cozy lakeside cabin he had rented for a few weeks to sort out his thoughts. Around him stretched a peaceful silence. Gentle waves lapped against the wooden piers of the dock, and the early sun rays tinted the water with golden hues. He took a deep breath of the cool air, feeling with each breath that the burden of the past was slipping further away. 2 weeks had passed since he left the home where he had spent most of his adult life. For the first time in a long time, he felt like himself. In the morning, he ran along the shore. During the day, he worked on plans for a new online project. In the evening, he read books he hadn't had time to think about before. His body was getting stronger, his mind clearer, and his heart lighter. He never suspected how much the feeling that he wasn't good enough had oppressed him. Now standing here, he realized that all this time, what had held him back was not his own imperfection, but other people's expectations. Lorelei sat on the couch in their almost empty apartment. After Declan left, she tried to continue living as before. Expensive purchases, brunches with friends, parties, but it all stopped bringing joy. She felt an emptiness that couldn't be filled with new dresses and champagne glasses. Even her friends began to distance themselves, no longer supporting her complaints about Declan. Maybe the problem isn't with him, but with you, Lorelei, one of her friends said with an apologetic smile one day. These words stung her more than she wanted to admit. She opened her laptop to deal with financial matters, but instead found herself searching for his profile on social media. Seeing his new photo, where he stood against the backdrop of the lake with a light smile, Lorelei felt a pang of envy. He looked happy. This word cut her heart because she realized she hadn't felt anything like that for a long time. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wrote a short message. Declan, I regret a lot. I was wrong. If you ever want to talk, I'd be happy to. Lorelei. She sent the message but received no reply. Declan saw this message a few days later. He looked at the phone screen for a long time, feeling his heart remain indifferent. Her opinion no longer bothered him. Her regret didn't concern him. He realized that her forgiveness was not what he needed. He had already forgiven himself for all those years he spent trying to live up to her standards. He typed a reply. Thank you for the message, Lorelei. I wish you happiness, but I'm moving on. Take care. Hitting send, he felt a final sense of liberation. This was a period, not a comma. He no longer looked back. A year later, Declan opened the door to his new home. He had moved to a small but cozy apartment in the city center. His online business was thriving, and he even started speaking at seminars, sharing his transformation story. His life was filled with new people who inspired and supported him. At one of these meetings, he met Tess, a woman with a warm smile and sparkling eyes. She worked as a yoga instructor and immediately attracted him with her sincerity. They talked for a long time about life, their dreams and mistakes. She didn't ask about his past, didn't judge him for who he was, but simply saw him as he was. Their relationship was built on trust and respect, which Declan had never experienced before. In her company, he felt free, but the most important thing was that he found this freedom within himself even before he met her. As for Lorelei, her life changed, but not as she expected. She had to sell the apartment to pay off accumulated debts. She returned to work to pay her bills, but for the first time, she began to wonder who she had become and what she had lost. The emptiness in her life was now louder than any noise she had tried to drown it out with before. She met Declan by chance on the street in the city. He was walking with Tess, laughing at something, his face radiant with calmness and happiness. Lorelei froze, not knowing what to say. Declan saw her, nodded with a polite smile, and walked on. She stood rooted to the spot, realizing she no longer had a chance to win him back. And for the first time in her life, she understood that true loss couldn't be measured in money, status, or appearance. She had lost the person who loved her, and in the process, she had lost herself. Declan's story wasn't about revenge. It was about growth, about how a person can find the strength to step out of the shadow of other people's expectations. His path was difficult, but he proved that even in the toughest circumstances, one could find a way to oneself, a way that leads to freedom, happiness, and love. Now he stood on the threshold of a new chapter in his life, looking at the future with gratitude. And this future belonged only to him.